Hi, good afternoon. I'm Ken Kirschenbaum. Thanks for joining us again. We have Jim and Jim Worcester here from Alarm Financial Services. Today's the second webinar in their series of 3. The first one, by the way, was 2 days ago when it was terrific. If you didn't catch it, you can see it on our website. The recording of the entire webinar will be there. It might be there now. If it's not, it'll be there any day. And this one today will also be recorded, and you'll be able to watch it again on our website. So today we're going to learn about financing for an acquisition, and I'll be turning it over to Jim Jr. I think is going to probably start, and then we'll be taking questions at the end. So please write your questions. I'll get them. I'll read them later at the end of the presentation, which we hope is going to be, I hope is going to be about a 20-25 minute presentation. Okay, so enjoy today's webinar, and we'll see you again on the 22nd. Right now, I'm turning it over to Jim Jr. and Jim Sr. Everybody pay attention. These guys know what they're talking about.
All right, thank you, Ken. And thanks for having this forum, and thanks also to your team, Jennifer and Eileen, for all their help getting us set up technically. We really appreciate that. And so, as you mentioned, this is the second of 3 webinars that we're going to be doing. The first one was a general overview of financing in the security alarm industry. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to drill down on one of the specific topics that we mentioned on Tuesday, and that's how to finance an acquisition. So I just got to sort of double check our presentation here, make sure we're doing everything right. And so just, by way of background, and I know this is going to be a little bit repetitive for those of you who attended Tuesday's webinar. So, bear with us on some of these repeat slides. But for those of you who were not participating in Tuesday's webinar or who are not familiar with AFS, we provide financing for recurring monthly revenue-based companies throughout the United States. And our specific focus is to do loans and lines of credit. And the range of the size transactions we do are anywhere from $150,000 to 1.5 million. In other words, that's the size of the loans that we're making in the forms of loans or lines of credit. We're the oldest funding company in the industry, and so I'm going to introduce Jim Sr. He can give you a little bit more background.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Ken, and thanks everybody for being here. We're the oldest funding company, and I think I'm the oldest guy in the industry, and I've been in it not since 87, but 67, when I bought a franchise for closed circuit TV, a couple of years, and then I went to Northeast Ohio as a sales manager of a non-existent sales force, and grew that business substantially. And the only reason I say that is not to, puff myself up, but to let you know that I had one account and then I had thousands of accounts, and there was a journey from the first until I sold the business in '86 to Security Link, Jim Covert, and Russ McNadell. And so that's my background. I'm an operating alarm dealer that got in the finance business. Jim, we had an operating company for a while. Jim has all this operating background. So hopefully we understand if you have one account or if you have several thousand, we kind of get it. Thanks.
So I think today, the timing of today's webinar about financing and acquisition, this is an opportune time. What we're seeing right now is a window is open for small to medium-sized alarm dealers to make acquisitions. There's kind of a confluence of events that we don't all always see happening at the same time, which I think is presenting a great opportunity for this audience and small, medium-sized alarm companies. You've got a few things going on. Right now, there's a significant wave from a demographic standpoint of dealers who are reaching retirement age and looking to sell. So that's on the supply side of things. On the demand side of things, just because of some of the changes in the national companies and the banks that finance them and big regional companies, there aren't as many big national buyers who are as active today making acquisitions as they have been in the past. So I think what that does is it presents an opportunity for a small to medium-sized alarm company, with the aid of financing from companies like us, to have an opportunity to make acquisitions that they might not have ever seen before. It might have been swept up by a big national company or a big regional company. And if those companies are backing off a little bit on their buying, this is opening the door for you to make acquisitions. So this is a good time, and so we think the timing of this presentation is right on. So we're going to talk a little bit about the factors that are driving companies to sell. Dad, you want to go from here?
Yes, you can read the slide. Things have changed out there since I got in the business. The fundamentals have not changed at all, but the players and the components and the pressures and the relief of pressures. And so there is a change in competitive landscape. Some people don't want to be involved in that world, and that motivates them to sell. Changing customer demands. Here again, I mean, there's huge opportunities today. By the way, I'm presently involved as an advisor and an investor in an operating alarm company. So I kind of like to think I'm current with the industry as of talking to the owner of it yesterday. Changing customer demands, it's maybe too difficult or just not worth it. Maybe it's time to exit. Retirement, and this is a two position. You want to retire, and you want to sell. You want to sell to the right buyer. They're your customers. You've built them up over the years. So go out and find a friendly competitor, somebody you trust, and you're the seller, he's the buyer, or she's the buyer. We will provide all the money needed. So you can go out and facilitate your own retirement. The buyer also, if you're a seller, you may make an arrangement with the buyer to stay on board. Maybe you're a technician, totally devote yourself to that endeavor. You're a sales rep, totally involve yourself to that endeavor. And if you have nothing else to do, no payroll, no service calls, nothing, imagine if you make your own arrangements with the seller, the seller will probably be happy to have you on board, the customer base, and that's a big extra income potential for you. Okay, here we go. Why? What's a buyer looking for? A lot of times, organic growth, leveling off. You want to fill in some geography. There's a whole lot of new. What am I talking about? Look at the new services that you can sell. This is a customer base perhaps that hasn't been approached with many of the new services. Significant potential. There are fewer competing buyers. Jim alluded to that earlier. And the RMR, we're finding not 100%, but the overall trend is it's being reduced. Okay.
So on that point, one of the early discussions, obviously, that we have with dealers who are looking to make an acquisition is, how do they come up with what to pay, right? How do they come up with a value that they think is worthwhile? And, there's never really just a single factor. There are a lot of factors that come into play when you're trying to figure out what you should pay for when you're making an acquisition. Certainly the size of the transaction is going to come into play. What the attrition looks like, the cash flow that's coming. In other words, is this high profit margin company or a low profit margin company? As Jim Sr. mentioned, what are the opportunities if you buy these accounts to provide new services? Is this company growing quickly, or is it sort of stagnant? So we consider these to all be internal factors that, as a buyer, you're trying to analyze in coming up with what to pay for the accounts. But there's also external factors, right? So it doesn't really, this is irrespective of what's going on within the company. What's going on out in the bigger industry is also going to have a play in how the price is determined. So is the industry outlook positive or negative, which would consequently drive the number of investors wanting to get involved and the number of buyers being involved. What are interest rates looking like at that particular time in the interest rate cycles? And so timing, right? What's going on with the seller? Are they trying to get something done really quickly before the end of the year? And so they're, maybe you have a nice opportunity, et cetera. So there's both internal and external factors that come into play. So let's take a look just sort of how you process that and kind of get into the numbers a little bit. And how much should you pay? So we touched on this a little bit in Tuesday's session, and we're going to go a little bit deeper today, specifically about an acquisition. So we're going to look at a hypothetical example. 300 accounts. I used this same example on Tuesday with an average RMR of $35. And in this example, this is for monitoring only. So the seller's RMR is $10,500 a month of recurring revenue. And a lot of times when we're talking to dealers, they just sort of stop at this point. Well, it's $10,500 a month of RMR. How much should I pay? And that's not really going to get us the answer that we need. What we really need to do is to start looking at, okay, well, you start with $10,500 a month of recurring revenue, but what is really going to the bottom line? So we need to start layering in the costs, direct costs like central station and cell, billing and overhead, right? I mean, even if you did credit card ACH processing for every customer, that's typically going to be 2 or 3% just a charge from your processing company. So you've got these expense items that you can't ignore, right? So in this example, that $10,500 a month of recurring revenue, when you take out these expenses, drops down to $7,350. And not every company is going to have that same profile. Some are going to have more profit margin than others. And that's really how we start getting into what it's valued at and how much you should pay. And certainly one of those determinants is going to be, all right, if I'm borrowing the money to make this acquisition, what's that going to cost me from a monthly standpoint on terms of a loan? So as you can see, we took a look at a few different purchase prices and how that translated into monthly loan payments. So if you decided, all right, I think I'd like to pay a 28 multiple on these accounts, that's a purchase price of $294,000. When we calculate that out on a 5-year loan, it's a loan payment of $6,110. So you could see, all right, well, I can cover that loan payment and have a little cushion there. So that's from a cash flow standpoint, that looks good. Well, what if the buyer was looking for something more, a higher multiple? They're looking for 32 times. Well, that would translate into a $336,000 purchase price. And the loan payment that goes with that would be, getting closer to $7,000. It's getting now a little bit tighter there. If they're looking for something like a 36 multiple, it's going to be a little bit tougher for you as a buyer, perhaps, to justify, because now that $378,000 purchase price is going to translate into a loan payment of $7,855. So this is sort of how buyers zero in on what they're comfortable paying, right? And this is how financing an acquisition works. The main concept is that you are using these assets, the accounts, as collateral for a loan, and you're borrowing the money to pay the seller their purchase price. So that comes from a lender like us. So using our money to pay the purchase price to the seller. And then you're using the customer's money in the form of the RMR that they're already under contract to pay to repay the loan, right? So this makes it a cash flow, a deal that works from a cash flow standpoint, and you're not dipping into your pocket to pay this deal upfront or on a monthly basis. And so this is really the fundamental theory behind borrowing to make an acquisition, which is the point of this presentation, right? Now, this came up, I think in Tuesday's seminar, we talked about, well, what about attrition? You start out with that 10,500, but you're not going to end up with 10,500. And that's absolutely true. However, what we find is that when dealers who we work with make an acquisition, they're able to replace that RMR that's lost through attrition through referrals, through opportunities to increase the RMR, opportunities to add new services. So that's why the idea of making a model in which that RMR stays steady has got some fundamental soundness to it, because when you go into a purchase opportunity, your expectation is not just going to be that you're just going to sit on what you have, that you're going to develop that into more RMR. But in this model, or this slide that I'm showing, this is just monitoring RMR, right? There's lots of other types of RMR. As a matter of fact, Ken's newsletter today, which I'm sure everybody read, talked about fire contracts. And why, Ken asked the question, why would you be leaving other RMR opportunities on the table, or other revenue opportunities? And he was talking about using the all-in-one contract versus a fire monitoring specific only contract. And it's absolutely right? You've got test and inspection that comes out of your relationship with your customers. You've got service contracts, leases, video monitoring, managed access control, and more. So the point being, when you're taking a look at the RMR that you're purchasing, you got to look at each of these individual, we call them buckets, individual buckets of RMR. And the reason is there's going to be a different profile of profit margin for each of these. Some of these areas are going to be higher profit than others. Like monitoring might be very high profit, service contracts might be a little bit lower profit. So the point being, when you're analyzing the RMR that you're thinking of buying, don't just look at it as all this worth, all the same, right? You want to really, very early in the process with a seller, start to drill down on the buckets or the types of RMR, and you're going to want to find out how much profit is coming out of each of those buckets of RMR. And that's going to really help you determine overall what the price is. So what we say then is, each of these areas has got its own profit margin, and that has to be taken into consideration. So, we're talking about RMR, and obviously that's fundamental when you're analyzing an acquisition opportunity, how much to pay. But with an acquisition, there's a lot more that comes on with than just the RMR. So, Dad, you want to go ahead and take it from there?
I'm going to put my alarm dealer hat on. And this is one of the reasons, because of our experience in finance and in operating, we have a ton, we look at this when we make a buy. We used to make a buy when we were an operating company, and one now in this advisory capacity. So there's significantly more value than just the rate. And here it is in front of you: billable service, defend against competitors. You can probably either quickly or shortly increase the price. You've got upgrades and add-ons. A lot of this will be discussed on next Tuesday. You're opening a new market visibility with your yard signs and stickers, etc. And this customer base the two things might happen. They might bring into your business an area of income production that you're not enjoying at this point, and you will look at the components of the RMR you're buying and see what you could add. So this is just not it's just not the rate. In fact, this is huge. I'm going to focus a little bit on acquiring talent. Our knowledge is today that most people need techs. They're looking for them. What if you get a couple of techs with this acquisition? What if you get a seasoned, productive sales rep? And then referrals, which I will drill down on much more. But this is huge. If you work this base, 300 accounts in our Jim's example, you'll get referrals. You'll get brand new RMR to pay for your loan, even as attrition fits in. So this was a huge component part whenever I made an acquisition in my operating company. How do I raise money for an acquisition? Well, hello. Can we go to the next slide? Cash on hand, you can throw some in. Investors, now this is interesting. I was talking to somebody the other day about an investor, and what happens is you just don't get the investor, you get the investor's spouse, you get their children, brother-in-law. The whole component, the dynamic of your company may change with an investor. That's something that I've learned to be cautious about. Seller financing, well, the seller becomes your bank. Is that really what you want? And of course, us, loans. And we, because we're the oldest, and that must tell you something, we've been successful at this. And so that's how you raise money.
So loans, I know when we talk to dealers, they'll often say, well, what about my local bank? I can get a loan from my local bank. And what we often find is that the focus of the local bank is going to be a little different than our focus. They're not really conversant with our industry specifically and the value of RMR. So often, dealers we work with can raise a little bit of money with their local bank, but perhaps not as much as they need to do the acquisition. So we find that there are some limitations as far as that goes, and that's why working with a lender who specializes in the industry is often the best way to go. So how does the process work, right? This is a multifaceted process, and so I think when dealers come to us, they're really, as much as looking for financing, they're looking for guidance, right? I've never made an acquisition before. How do I do this? And so, we kind of work with them through the process. Sometimes even in finding a seller, dealers will come to us without a particular seller in mind and say, listen, I'd like to make an acquisition. How do I even find a seller? So we'll help them right from there, help them, deciding how to make an offer and negotiate the price. Certainly with conducting the due diligence, because the assets, the accounts that they're buying and they're paying for are also the accounts that are the collateral for our loan. So we're active in the due diligence because we have a vested interest in doing so. We're going to take them through then, and they're going to go through executing a purchase agreement. We would then pay the seller. There's a transition of accounts, and and go meet your customers. And a question came up on Tuesday's webinar was about reporting, and whether we ever impose that they bring on like a controller or somebody like that in order to handle the reporting that goes along with having a loan. And there are, again, this is where we can give guidance in the process. There's companies that can do that reporting for you that do. So Mitch Reitman Consulting Group is a frequent contributor to Ken's newsletters, and that's a perfect example. Mitch's firms will do that reporting and kind of take that load off of the dealer. So but even if you don't have an acquisition opportunity right on your plate today, it's still a good idea to start engaging with a lender even before you're ready to go. You want to first off get an idea of how much money you would qualify for. So should you be looking at acquisitions that are 200 accounts or 2,000 accounts, right? And as I said, we can also then help you find sellers. We know about a lot of activity going on. People contact us all the time about selling accounts, and so we can keep an eye out for you or make a targeted effort to go find sellers for you. And most importantly, you want to be able to jump on an acquisition opportunity when it does present itself. Right? You want to be able to move quickly. And so if you start engaging with a lender like us and you get pre-qualified for a loan, you know how much you can afford, and you can dive right in when the opportunity presents itself. But there are other reasons to borrow besides doing an acquisition. The focus of today was acquisition. Dan, you want to take it from here?
Yes, and I guess every one of these had, over the many years, had experience with consolidate existing debt. That's self-explanatory. Buy out a partner, cover upfront costs of large projects. It got us into doing big municipal, all kinds of big projects. There's significant time elapsed between the start and when we got paid. Pay off investors, I've done that. fuel organic growth. Now, this is the subject of the next webinar. And even if you're not in the acquisition mode right now, was being involved in building companies, building RMR over the years. I just love this part of the world because you have an asset, and that's ability to borrow that you may not be using, which is, somebody told me I had to use it. Next Tuesday, we're going to address all kinds of RMR creation activities. So I'm looking forward to it. And I hope some of you join, even if you're not in the loan mode today, come on board. And by the way, you may be able to contribute too. We'd love to hear your story.
Thanks, Ken. That's it. And we're ready for questions.
Almost caught me off guard that you guys are ready. Okay, so let me get to see if we have any questions that have come in yet. And okay, let me get it started. I want to point out something that struck me during the presentation. A lot of times I hear from potential buyers, and they're hesitant about their deal. They're not sure about their deal. They're not sure whether they're making the right decision. They're not sure what price they should be offering. They're not sure what terms they should be looking for. They have different issues. I'll just lump them all into hesitancy about the deal. And it's interesting that AFS is there and can be there to offer a lot of guidance in that stage of going forward with a potential deal. And I think it's interesting that the lender and borrower may have different issues that they need to consider, because they also may have different expectations. And you would expect the lender to be a bit more conservative than the buyer. So you might have a buyer that is all gung-ho to pay 40 times on gross revenue, gross RMR. He may be so desperate to get the accounts that he is willing to overlook accounts that are on the fringe of his territory, maybe beyond his territory, maybe in different states where he's not even licensed. And then he goes to AFS and says, well, now I have this opportunity. It's gonna there's X number of accounts, there's X number of X RMR, and I want to borrow the money from you guys. Okay. And all of a sudden AFS comes in and they say, well, okay, let us look at this deal and see what it looks like. And it could be that the conservative approach of AFS is something that a buyer will consider and then say, well, you know what? I understand your conservative approach. I've got these additional reasons, which maybe you can't just put down in dollars and cents, and I do want to go forward with this deal. So what you'll have then is, at least you'll have the input from a lender. You'll also have the lender, no doubt, saying, well, we understand and we still will go forward with your financing, but now you got to put a little more skin in the game in order for us to go forward with you. So that because we're not going to lend on 40 times, we're only going to lend on 32 times. So you need to come up with the other 8 if we want to go forward here, okay? Or we're not interested in accounts in Ohio when you're in Indiana, or something like that. So there are different expectations, but the input from the lender is invaluable and something that really you should be considering. I don't know how AFS deals with what do you do about I mean, I have, all professionals have this, including me, people that just want to waste your time. hey, AFS, I got a deal. I'm coming to you for the financing. Here, what do you think? Because you guys, I'm sure, get paid based on the deal, the transaction closing. I don't know whether they come to you and go, oh, by the way, you mind doing 50 hours worth of due diligence for us, and we'll let you know how much money we're going to borrow when we're all done. So that's something that I see you guys smiling because you've been there before, okay? And of course, so have I. Not from a lending perspective, but okay. So that's some observation. That's just some observation that I've made. And now now I've given an opportunity for the questions to start coming in. Okay, so here they are. Unless you guys want to respond to anything I've said, do you?
The only thing I would say to that is, and I think you would probably say the same thing. Maybe not. But I think having been in this business for so long, we've got the long-term perspective. And we know that a conversation that we have with a dealer today, it might not translate into a deal next week. It might be 3 years from now before we ever do a transaction with that dealer. And we know that, and we're fine with that. So we're not ever resistant to having companies call us just to bounce ideas off of us. I mean, it's amazing. We sort of track at a database when we first talk to somebody ever. And I'm doing a deal right now with somebody started talking to, I think, 5 years ago about doing an acquisition. It was just a concept then, and now it's a real, it's really happening. So we're fine with taking those calls.
Okay, you better get a new phone line because I'm going to start sending them over.
All right.
Here's some questions. What do you feel is acceptable attrition?
Oh.
Zero.
Zero, right.
Well, let's first start out, I think, from just a concept phase. I think there's a lot of dealers that we talk to that think of attrition as the net at the end of the month. Did they end up with more accounts than they started with, or fewer accounts than they started with? And I think one thing is important is to just have a consistent definition of attrition, right? Attrition does not take into account how many new accounts you brought in. It's about what you started the month with and how many of those you lost, right? So the first part of it is a lot of times we talk to dealers and say, well, we don't have any attrition. We end up every month with more accounts. And so first thing is to be able to drill down on that. But what's acceptable? I mean, I think in terms of for an acquisition, we work with dealers that know going into a deal that they're going to have high attrition because of what they've uncovered in the due diligence, but they've set a low purchase price, right? Maybe they're buying those accounts for 20 times and they know they're going to have some weed out, and that's priced it into the deal. So I'd say what's acceptable as attrition depends on what you're paying for the accounts. If you're paying a lot for the accounts, you're going to need it to be low attrition. But if you understand that you can get it for a low price, maybe you're willing to accept a little higher attrition.
Jim, in your model, you use what specific number?
When we work with dealers on just projecting, just when we're right at the beginning, we're often throwing in like a 10% number just to see how it works. And just to give them an idea of the reality with, okay, this is going to be a cash flow that's going to go away. So we'll use that number often as for a modeling number. And then once we get into
fine, and hopefully that answers your question.
Well, let me supplement. By the way, Jim Senior, a little closer to the mic. We're missing your valuable information. Let me supplement slightly. What is acceptable attrition? It's easy to say, look, traditional 3 to 7% we can tolerate. 7 and higher, 10, 13, 15, that starts to become a problem. Okay, lower than 3, wow, that's terrific. But we can't look at attrition in a vacuum because, as Jim points out, there's new sales. There's opportunity to increase revenue from existing accounts, upgrade accounts, increase the RMR. So one of the things that you want to be cognizant about with attrition the concept of attrition is that we do want to look at the bottom line at the end of the month, but we do want to look at it from the perspective of the customer list that was purchased in the acquisition. That's how you would know if you have a successful acquisition. You have this customer base, and this is the RMR when you bought it. Well, 6 months later, how many accounts do you have? What's the RMR now? Same thing at the end of a year. And don't forget, most deals are going to have, not all, but most deals are going to have a 1-year guarantee. And so it's going to be the seller that eats that attrition during the first year. Okay, if you plan your contract right and drafted it right and taken the appropriate precautions, it's the seller that eats that attrition during the first year. But you don't want to have a bad first year, because that bodes poorly for the second year and the third year. So you want to be careful about that. But so when you talk about what's acceptable attrition, there's a lot that goes into it, not just a number. Obviously, if you're a buyer and your seller says to you, well, we have historical attrition of 15%, that's a problem. So how do you deal with something like that? Well, you're not offering 40 times on that deal. I can tell you right now, you're going to be offering something a lot less. But let's get a few more questions. What are the current interest rates? You guys covered that the other day. Prime plus 6.
Yeah, do you want us to kind of talk about, I have a slide that we used before just to give a quick, our interest rate is prime plus 6. So today prime is at 3.25. So we're at 9.25. And what I mentioned when this came up, or when we made it a part of our presentation on Tuesday, is that sometimes gives people a little sticker shock when they're used to thinking of interest rates related to 30-year home mortgages. These are shorter term.
Wait, how about the Fed rate? It's 0.
You're right. Yeah.
You guys should be paying people to borrow your money.
Yeah. I know. If you can borrow at that rate, go for it. So these are, but with the loans we're doing are 5-year loans, much shorter loans, and so the impact of the attrition is not going to be, I'm not saying attrition, the interest rate isn't going to be as significant, because so much of the payment is principal, because that's got to get paid off in a shorter period of time. So I'll just throw this up here real quickly, and I'm happy to drill down with anybody offline in more detail. But we looked at, well, what if you did a deal at a lower interest rate, prime plus 3 instead of prime plus 6. And we looked at the revenue that you would get over the course of the period of time. And, it's not a big percentage difference when you look at the acquisition that you're doing in terms of, if you were able to get a prime plus 3 versus prime plus 6. It's certainly all of the costs related to an acquisition. What we find is that the interest rate is not really the big cost. There's a lot of other costs that by cost, I mean factors that can determine the profit on it. What multiple are you paying? How the pricing for the customers, what their costs are, things like that. So anyway, we're happy to drill down on this with more with dealers offline and take a look at a hypothetical purchase scenario and see what the impact is of the interest on their calculation.
And as an operating dealer, I needed to look at interest rates, but if it was not 18% in today's world, reasonable, it was a consideration, but it only blended into the loan payments. And then again, I had to look at the whole package, how many leads, how much this, how much that. So while it's critical, and it's a great question and a fair question, it becomes a very kind of a small component in your decision to make an acquisition.
I agree with you, and also AFS obviously it brings a lot to the table besides a favorable interest rate. But the question is, what's the interest rate? So before I leave the topic, let me just ask you this: what's the real effective interest rate if you were complying with the truth in lending laws? So if you were to say, well, it's a 10% and it's amortized and it's over 5 years. So Am I really looking at a 10% loan, or are there a bunch of points and other expenses that are going to be built into this loan, so that at the end of the day, I'm really paying 12% at the end? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a fair question, because banks will kind of handle this differently. We don't have a lot of like documentation fees, due diligence fees, legal fees, things like that. We don't sort of tack on nickel and dime a bunch of other fees. That's all kind of included in our rates. There is an origination fee on our deal, or some people call it a facility fee, and that's going to vary on the size of the transaction. It's we do deals from $150,000 up to $1 million, and so that's going to be more variable related to the size of the transaction.
You just raised an interesting question in my mind. Does AFS bring in other lenders that might impose their own obligations, or doing their own due diligence, or are we always dealing with AFS and AFS's way of doing things, as opposed to some unknown lender that all of a sudden is going to start breaking chops, basically, is one way I want to put it.
No, we're the sole lender in our deals.
Okay. Here's a question. Jim mentioned preparing to see how much a potential buyer would qualify for. What factors does AFA look at when considering qualifying a dealer versus the actual deal itself? Do you look at a dealer as opposed to a deal?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so sometimes alarm dealers will come to us and they have an idea about making an acquisition, but they also might want to just get a line of credit for their own internal growth plans, which again, we're going to talk about that specific organic growth on Tuesday. So we will look at it both ways. We'll say kind of like, okay, if you're just relying on your own company and your own RMR, we could lend you this much. If you want to go out and make an acquisition, then we can increase it, because you're going to have both your own accounts serving as collateral, as well as the seller's accounts get pooled in there to give you a larger base of collateral. So we're going to look at it from both perspectives, but largely from our standpoint, it's going to be driven by the RMR. The more RMR a dealer has, the more they can borrow.
Well, a dealer with a really poor reputation, I'm sure, is going to have a harder time borrowing, no matter what his RMR is, over a dealer with a good reputation. That just that's common sense, I would say, right?
It is, but I do get questions about, well, my personal credit isn't so great. I've had to build this company up, and so how much do we look at that? And we understand that aspect of it. So we're really focused on the accounts and the RMR. And so even if somebody has got credit that's less than stellar as an individual, that's not going to be the overriding factor. We're really looking at the accounts and the performance of the RMR.
All right, well, here's some free advice to AFS then. So what do you do when you get I'm sure, and I know you must look at it. You get an alarm company that comes to you, they want to borrow some money, and a little bit of due diligence on your part finds out that there's 15 consumer complaints, and maybe an action by the Attorney General to shut them down. I got a feeling you're not making much of a loan to that guy. Okay, so let's move on. Here's an alarm dealer scratching her head with this question. Hey, we put quotes out there all the time, meaning to buy accounts, in the hope that they fly. That's business. I don't imagine they do due diligence for free. That's not a question. I'll turn it into a question. How much due diligence do you do? I guess I was mentioning that before. You guys seem to devote an awful lot of time. At what point do you say to your potential customer, hey, we're not here to do your due diligence for free?
Right. Well, we have an early pre-qualification that we can go through, where we're going to focus on ruling out the deal killer items, right? So we try to get those, eliminated at the front end. to see whether we look like we can do a deal or not. And so for that, we can do that relatively quickly with what we call our pre-qualification.
At no charge.
Right.
Here's some potential business. We have an acquisition where seller will finance, but wants 30% down. Are you interested in providing the money for the down payment?
Yes.
Well, thanks for that very simple answer. Yes, if the seller subordinates, not yes if we are to subordinate. Am I right or wrong?
Yeah, a lot of it is come down to that seller's position in there, right? So they want to carry a note, they want to do the financing, but they want to get something up front. So we just sort of make an arrangement with them on that. And to your point, Ken, that might be what it is. It might be their note might be subordinated, something like that. It's easy to get it accomplished with that concept.
Okay. Here's someone that wanted me to push you on the interest rate because you're lower than their bank. I think we answered the interest rate pretty good. Did you give an effective rate? Did you say what the effective rate could actually end up with? Because let's say it's 9%. We've talked about with the add-ons and whatever else there is that usually another 1%, another 2%, or it doesn't even come to that kind of number? Do you know?
I mean, our highest, I think, facility fee might be 5%. So would be, if it's a 5-year loan, that's adding 1% per year. So that's at the high end. If you were to be the most conservative estimate.
I was looking at the next question. You said an extra 5% add-in?
Well, I said that's the highest that we do on a.
Okay.
But that's 5. That's a one-time. So you'd add 1 point per year. So that's only adding 1% per year.
Oh, so your 5% is on the overall interest rate, not okay. It's not an additional. You're not going from 9% to 14%.
No.
Okay. Here's a good question. Seller has less than desirable monitoring agreements, or in some cases, no contracts. How do you handle this? And this is exactly what I said when I first started to talk. There's the buyer, AFS's potential customer, who wants to buy a deal, and they want to buy it with AFS's money. And let's see who's more anxious to do the deal. So how do you deal when you have crummy or no contracts?
So typically, the buyer is going to be working with the seller to get those contracts replaced with a good Kirschenbaum contract.
Wait, but now you're changing the scenario. Now you're taking a buyer with a seller with crummy or no contracts, and you're saying, well, this deal is going to end up with Kirschenbaum contracts, so we're okay with it. No.
Right.
Let's stick with the crummy deal right from the get-go. The answer is you're not going to finance it because you're smarter than the buyer. You're not as anxious as the buyer is.
Right. So those would be considered, non-qualified RMR. It's not on a good contract. Right. So when when a good contract is obtained, that becomes qualified RMR. And that's the point at which you should pay for it. And then that's the point at which you would be borrowing the money from us. So this can happen with deals we work on. It can happen over time. So as the new contracts are being obtained, the seller is getting paid on a gradual basis, maybe a monthly basis, as those new contracts are being obtained. And so they're borrowing from us on a monthly basis to pay the seller.
And actually,
recontracting, it happens a lot. So don't let that. It's not a good place to be. You shouldn't be there. But if you are, we believe me, we've done a lot of recontracting over the years, a lot, and people are surprised at how successful that endeavor is.
Right. What I was about to say is if one of my clients that's doing the buying would never be in that position. They would already be getting new contracts. They wouldn't just unless of course the multiple was somewhere, between 10 and 18 times. Then if you're buying garbage, okay, at least you're not paying for it. You're not paying that much for it, and you could figure you're going to go out and get these customers re-signed or on proper contracts. And if you lose half of them, you're still okay because you paid half what you should have, or less than half.
We don't lose that.
This moves into the next question. And to that attrition point, how do they calculate attrition? I think it's pretty simple, but you can answer it.
How do we calculate it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in the most basic sense, we're taking a look at a time period. If you're measuring it over a year, we say, well, what was your RMR at the beginning of that period? And what was your RMR at the end of that period, subtracting out the ads that you did.
Right. We're not letting you add in anything else. We want to know what accounts you bought and how many of those accounts you actually lost. That's what we want to know for attrition.
Right. The one thing that we will let add in though would be a move resign, where the person the Joneses cancel on Main Street, but then you pick them up at their new home on State Street. So
that wouldn't be considered attrition though. That would be outside the definition of the attrition though.
Right.
The definition of attrition, especially during the first year, is going to be almost defined. I guess it's going to be defined by the contract, because anything that's kicked back to the seller and comes off the purchase price doesn't matter from the buyer's perspective or the lender's perspective. Well, except the lender has given out a certain amount of money. That's an interesting issue, by the way. What do you do about you financed the deal and it was $300,000 and you financed 100% of it for whatever reason. You financed 300,000 of it, okay? At the end of a year, they lost 10% in attrition. So now the purchase price has dropped to, what was that, $270,000? They've dropped $30,000 off the purchase price. Does the lender require some kind of money back at that point? Because the purchase price has now been reduced.
First of all, what I'm hearing for these questions is, I think, we need a webinar on attrition.
Okay.
So, but to answer your question, yeah,
then don't give away too much information now.
But obviously there's a lot of questions about it, and it's a huge topic. So I think you could easily do a webinar on attrition. But to answer the question about that how does it affect a loan? If you were doing a $300,000 acquisition and it had a 10% holdback, the amount that would be getting borrowed at close from us would be the $270,000. That's the closing payment, not the $300,000. Now, what we do is we in our evaluation of how much the dealer can borrow, they're pre-qualified for that other $30,000. So in the event they get to the 12-month reconciliation and there's been no attrition, they have the ability to borrow that $30,000 from us to pay the seller their holdback.
Okay, I don't want to stay on that topic because we have a couple more questions and only a few more minutes. What are the red flags that should be looking for in my book of business before I seek a loan? You got to keep these answers brief because we're running out of time.
Yeah, one of the things is, do you already have a bank loan or something like that? What else? No contracts. That's got to be the biggest thing. I mean, if you don't have any contracts, we don't have anything to lend against. Or if you don't have good contracts.
With technology changes, in particular 4G sunset, how do you factor old technology accounts with respect to the multiple? Obviously, it's going to be less. Okay.
Yeah, so this is something that we're going to, through our due diligence, bring to the attention of the buyer if they haven't already figured it out themselves. And we're going to advise them, say, all right, what costs might you have associated with upgrading these sunsetted radios over the next couple of years? Factor that cost into your decision about how much to pay.
Here's a seller that wants to know how much time she should figure a buyer is going to want her to hang around after a sale, in terms of her employment agreement with the buyer. Let me comment on that quickly. That's going to depend on your deal, number one, and there may be no time, there may be some time. You may have an interest in hanging around if you've given a guarantee for a year. It might be in your interest to hang around and try and minimize the loss of accounts. You guys have a quick response other than that?
No, you know as well as anybody.
Yeah. Tax considerations for the seller. What about future capital gain rates? Well, vote Republican. That's all I can recommend, and hopefully we'll keep our capital gains rates where they are. So that's other than that, that's beyond where we are. What multiple of RMR does AFS typically lend at?
Mm-hmm.
You have told us the amount to be paid each month, but what multiple of RMR do you lend at? So I guess what they're saying, what this question really is, and right now that's the last one we have. If a buyer has agreed or wants to agree to a 45 or 50 multiple, which brings the purchase price to a certain level, what's going to happen when they come to AFS and say, we want to borrow this money to make this acquisition? Is AFS going to say, wait a minute, we don't lend once you go over X multiple? What, it just doesn't make any sense to us. The deal won't make any sense to us. I'm going to answer again for you though. Obviously, if you have a strong buyer with its own accounts, and AFS is looking at this buyer and believes that the buyer is viable, would be able to make these payments even without the new accounts, then makes the deal safer to lend on. It's just obvious. But if you look at it, if you're looking at it from 100% financing to a company that is going to depend on the purchased accounts to make the payments, now the lender needs to be careful. And so what they're asking you is, I guess what they're really asking you is, what's the rate? Where do you see the multiple right now? What's your multiple tolerance?
Right. So the way that these deals are typically done is they're typically asset purchase. And so the buyer, these new accounts are getting folded in with the accounts that the buyer already has. And so that's their pool of collateral, right? So the more RMR that a dealer already has, the more flexible they can be, as you alluded to, Ken, about paying a higher multiple. So if a dealer who's got the small amount of RMR is trying to buy somebody with a lot of RMR, it's going to be more difficult for them to pay a super high multiple on that. So I know I didn't answer the question, what multiple do we lend at, because that's not really the way that it works. We really look at what's the size of the loan, and then what's the ability to repay the loan. So it's not always just a straight like a purchase multiple.
Right. Well, there's a lot more we could talk about and spend a lot more time, but you know what? We're out of time. And so we're going to see everybody again on the 22nd, September 22nd at noon. That'll be our next webinar. And if I can get these guys to do more webinars, I'll be happy to sponsor them and promote them, and we'll see where we go. But anyway, I want to thank everybody for participating today and attending today. And final words, guys, and then we're going to close this webinar out.
See you Tuesday.
Okay,
Yeah.
There you go.
We're going to have a good time Tuesday, and
Okay.
a lot of benefits to be expressed.
Okay, stay healthy, everybody. See you Tuesday.